Welcome to the Public Health Association of Australia One Health Special Interest Group webinar on high pathogenicity avian influenza H5N1 and what you need to know to prepare for its likely arrival in Australia. I'm Dr Britton. I'm the convener of the One Health Special Interest Group within PHAA. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today. For me, it is the Djara Djara Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation in beautiful rural Victoria, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, as well as the emerging leaders. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here today in this webinar. We're delighted to welcome PHAA members and others joining this webinar. We have over 530 registrations for the webinar, which I believe reflects the interest in learning about HPAI and One Health, preparedness, and to gain a better understanding on what individually we need to know to prepare for this likely arrival of this H5N1 subtype. If you are not a member of PHAA, I would encourage you to join and support public health advocacy and policy development. I would like to also acknowledge the One Health activities, including the One Health Surveillance Initiative of Wildlife Health Australia, that is supporting Australia and the Asia Pacific region to prevent and prepare and respond to wildlife diseases like HPAI. Some of you may not be familiar with One Health, and in case this concept and systems approach is new, I'd like to share the globally agreed One Health high-level expert panel definition of One Health, being an integrated and unifying approach to sustainably balance and get to optimize health at the human, animal, plant and ecosystem, given this interconnectedness and also the interdependence of the systems. We will hear in the webinar how this approach mobilises multiple sectors, disciplines and communities at varying levels of society to work together to foster a well-being and tackle the threats of this to our health and ecosystems like HPAI. The webinar recording and Robyn Alders' PowerPoint PDF will be available on the PHAA One Health SIG website, and some useful resources and web links. Could you please place all questions in the Zoom Q&A while speakers are presenting and during the webinar, and we will endeavour to have all these questions addressed during the webinar, though we'll place all the questions and answers on our One Health SIG website after the webinar. So I'd like to commence by introducing our first speaker, Professor Robyn Alders. Robyn is a veterinarian and honorary professor with the ANU Development Policy Centre, the Department of Pathobiology and Population Science at the Royal Veterinary College in London, and Veterinary Department of Infectious Diseases and Global Health with Tufts University in the USA. She is also a Senior Consulting Fellow with the Chatham House Global Health Program. Robyn is a Commissioner with the Lancet PPATS Commission on Prevention of Viral Spillover, reducing the risk of pandemics through primary prevention. For over 30 years, she has worked closely with smallholder farmers in the Sub-Saharan African area and South and Southeast Asia and Oceania as a veterinarian researcher, and colleague with an emphasis on the development of sustainable infectious disease control in animals in resource-limited areas in support of food and nutritional security, income generation, wildlife conservation and public health. Robyn's research and development interests include food and nutrition, security systems, One Health, gender equity, inclusive policies, and science communication. Welcome, Robyn, and I'll over to you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Just to say, I'm joining you via satellite, so I'm going to turn my video off and let's get started. So hopefully you can now see my presentation. If I don't hear anything, I'm going to keep going. Once again, thanks very much for the opportunity to set the scene for today's important discussion, and greetings to you from Gundungurra country here in New South Wales. This cartoon by David Pope appeared earlier this week, and it clearly depicts that the arrival of migrant birds this spring poses a significant threat to human and animal life in Australia. However, these migration patterns have been in place for thousands of years. So what's different about this year? Well, I'd like to suggest that we need to consider more than wild birds. Global poultry production has increased dramatically since the end of the Second World War. And in the 1970s, many in the public health community suggested that the risk of coronary heart disease could be reduced by eating less fatty red meat and more poultry meat. The little blue arrow here indicates when I graduated as a vet. And interestingly, during my studies, a high pathogenicity avian influenza was a rare disease, and it was controlled by stamping out infected and in-contact chicken flocks. From the 1990s onwards, outbreaks have become increasingly more common as the chicken and human populations have also increased. Now we're going to move on to clade 2.3.4.4b that's causing global concern. And I'm going to briefly list some of the key drivers that I think have contributed to the current crisis. As I mentioned, a huge increase in intensively produced chickens that's been accompanied by an increasing size and density of commercial chicken units that have contributed to increasing outbreaks. And as these outbreaks have increased, some countries have introduced vaccination, commencing in 1995 as an alternative to stamping out. In 1996, the H5N1 ancestor of the current clade of interest emerged in East Asia. It spread rapidly in East and Southeast Asia, and this was facilitated by delayed diagnosis due to the fact that high mortality to diseases such as Newcastle disease, which is clinically indistinguishable to high path AI, were very common. Millions of birds were euthanized across thousands of farms, frequently without compensation to farmers. This meant that producers might report once, but they generally didn't report a second time. Insufficient funding and a lack of carcass disposal techniques that were tailored to local conditions contributed to environmental contamination. And at the same time, commercial chicken lines that had been selected for high production were found to have lowered immune function. All of this has ended up with the huge amount of circulating H5N1 virus that provided opportunities for the evolution of the lineage such that its host range expanded along with its geographical spread. Clearly, my take is that the evolution of H5N1 has been mediated by human activity. So if we're the problem, what are we going to do about it? This year, FAO and the World Organization for Animal Health launched a summary of the revised global strategy in May, and the full strategy is going to become available to the public very shortly. I was part of the team working on this revised strategy, and which has 3 objectives. First objective is to prevent HPAI epidemics, panzootics, and negative impacts on biodiversity through multi-sectoral early detection and control. Secondly, to protect poultry value chains, livelihoods, trade, and the health of humans, ecosystems, and other animals from avian influenza impacts. And finally, to transform poultry value chains to improve resilience to avian influenza and other disease threats. The global strategy aims to guide the development of regional and national actions through the global framework for the progressive control of transboundary animal diseases. As you read through the key actions that are listed here, you'll be aware that Australia is already well advanced with many of them. So instead of going through what we're already doing well, what I'd like to suggest is that Australia has an opportunity to value add to this process, to build resilience across our health landscape. This can include a national food policy, which I think is needed and that will yield the best outcomes if it is co-designed by committed, experienced people from human health, animal health, plant health, farmers, producers, the food industry, and consumers. It's important that joint risk assessments are done and that they adopt a multi-hazards risk management approach. We need to build and support networks, and really to do this in Australia and regionally. I feel that One Health needs to expand from academic workshops and departmental boardrooms to achieve active community engagement and implementation. This current threat from H5N1 has really focused our attention. I'd like to think that we can use this opportunity to advance support for safe, sustainable, and resilient food systems. I'm going to finish this short presentation with a few tips that I learnt during the first wave of H5N1 in Southeast Asia. We all know that effective communication is key to effective disease prevention and control. But in terms of a One Health approach to communication, we're not quite there yet. This P diagram from FAO helped me to understand the different phases of communication. And in a One Health partnership, before communicating with the public, we really need to invest time in bringing our One Health sectoral partners together by understanding the roles, the strengths, the limitations of each. We also need communication that's tailored to each key target group. The content that we share and the way it's shared needs to be accessible across needs to be accessible to different disciplines and language groups, and we must ensure that translations are well done. I can certainly say that I've had some historical encounters where translation was done by people who use the language formally, but had not kept up to date with how language is used on the streets. In these days of misinformation, understanding who our target groups are and who they see as trusted sources and the information channels that they access have never been more important. It's crucial that we involve communication specialists and take time to develop credible, clear, and concise and consistent messages across our One Health partners. And importantly, we need to commit to pre-testing before wide dissemination, continuous improvement, and making sure that sufficient funds are allocated to these key parts of our communication activities to ensure the long-term success of our initiatives. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much for your time, and I'll hand back to Andrea.
Thank you very much, Robyn. That was an excellent presentation and overview, and very thought-provoking, and I'm sure we'll have quite a few questions. I'd like to introduce our second speaker now, Dr. Michelle Wille, a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre of Pathogen Genomics, University of Melbourne, and has an honorary appointment at the WHO Collaborating Centre for Reference and Research on Influenza. Her research is primarily focused on the ecology and evolution of avian influenza viruses, and she has contributed to Australia's preparedness for HPAI and response to the domestic H7 outbreaks in Victoria. Beyond influenza, Dr. Wille is also interested in the ecology of avian viromes. We look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Andrea. So for this talk, before we go forward, I just want to go backward a little bit and talk a little bit about what HPAI means, what these 2344 clade name means, just for a little bit of context. So what you're looking at here on the left, that's just a diagram of the influenza A virus. And this virus is categorized in two ways. The first is by subtypes, and the second is by pathotypes. So on the outside of the virus, we've got two lollipops called the HA and the NA. Now, thanks to COVID, we're all excellent virologists, and we've learned about the spike protein, which is what sits on the outside of the SARS coronavirus 2. Now, if you take that spike and you break it into two pieces, what you're going to get is essentially the HA and the NA of influenza. Now, avian influenza viruses have probably been in birds since birds have been birds, which means there is a lot of diversity out there. So much so that in wild birds, we have 16 different HA types and 9 different NA types. And these viruses can kind of mix and match these types such that we report them in combination. So the name of the game for today's talk is H5N1, but if you've been reading the news, you will recently have heard about H7N9 and H7N2 and all those kinds of things. Now, within the different HAs, we can further subdivide these. So within H5, for example, we have a series of genetic clades. And unlike COVID, where they did a sensible thing and called them alpha, beta, delta, etc., we have gone for this horrific naming scheme, such that we've got things like 2.3.4.4b, which is the name of the game. Now, I would argue that sort of these genetic clades are sort of somewhat similar in terms of diversity to the COVID variants, and those HA subtypes are much, much, much more different. Now, this is subtypes. The next part is pathotypes. So we have low pathogenic and high pathogenic viruses. You may sometimes hear them referred to as highly pathogenic or high pathogenicity, but same. So low pathogenic viruses, well, these are the viruses that have been around in birds since birds have been birds. They comprise all the HA subtypes and all the NA subtypes, and birds tend to carry these viruses without any clinical signs of disease. So we can go out in the wintertime and catch ducks. We will get about maybe 20% of the ducks may be positive, but the ducks are just doing their general ducky thing. Now, the concern is when these low-path H5 and H7 viruses from wild birds jump into poultry. It is within poultry production that we see the evolution of virulence, and the resulting viruses are called high pathogenicity viruses. These viruses are very lethal. They kill a lot of birds. They evolve in poultry, and of course, the concern is when they jump out of poultry and back into wild birds. Now, as was mentioned previously, most high pathogenicity viruses have been controlled through culling. The exception is this lineage called the Goose Guangdong lineage, which emerged in 1996. It was never controlled. It continued to spread in domestic poultry, particularly in Asia, for decades and decades. Since then, there have been a number of step changes in the virus, but the key thing is that in 2021, we saw the emergence of clade 2.3.4.4b and the combination of H5N1, and that spread like wildfire, starting a panzootic, or an animal pandemic. Now, one of the key changes in this new virus compared to the old virus is the diversity of animals that it infects and where it remains reservoirs in. So here is just a little basic and simple schematic of what we're used to dealing with in terms of HPAI in Australia and even in Asia in the past. So these viruses are found in poultry, they're spread in poultry, they're maintained in poultry. They may jump back into wild birds sometimes, but they're generally not maintained in wild birds. So they're generally more straightforward to control. So here in Australia, we did that through stamping out, that is culling poultry. Now this 2344B thing, well, it is a bit of a mess. Okay, what we're seeing is the virus is going from poultry to wild birds and back. It's being maintained in wild birds, it's being maintained in poultry. It's jumped into mammals on so very many occasions, generally scavenging and predatory mammals, which is not very surprising. If you're a little fox and life gets hard, suddenly you arrive in a place and there's 10,000 dead wild birds. Well, it's an all-day buffet. But unfortunately, that's how many of these animals are being infected. There have been a few exceptions, though. We've seen sort of this virus being transmitted through, more than about 50,000 pinnipeds in South America. So that's seals and sea lions. We're in the middle of trying to understand what's going on in dairy cattle in the US. Hundreds of dairy cattle of herds have now tested positive across 14 states. And it hasn't jumped into humans a few times now as well. So it is a much bigger problem and it is much harder to control. And this is sort of a very characteristic One Health problem because we're seeing it in wild animals, we're seeing in agricultural animals, and we're also seeing cases in humans. Now, all of this has, of course, led to panzootic or animal pandemic. So what you're looking at here is notifications to the World Organization for Animal Health. A dot doesn't necessarily mean a number. It could be 3 dead birds. It could be hundreds of millions of birds in these big, massive poultry operations. And then I've just differentially colored wild birds and poultry there. On top of that, I've added a number of arrows to show you the global spread since about 2021. So briefly, starting from Europe, we had the virus jump across the ocean into North America in late 2021. It has since jumped into North America on a few additional occasions. It rapidly spread through North America and about 1 year later entered South America. It then traveled the 6,000-kilometer spine of South America in about 6 months. Now that's very fast for a virus that's essentially spreading through killing animals. It's not like a virus that's jumped onto a plane like COVID did. This is pretty much through dead animal to dead animal to dead animal. So it's actually really quite striking. About 1 year after arriving in South America, we got the first detections in the subantarctic, and just a few months later on the Antarctic Peninsula. Oceania is the only place on the planet that is free from this virus. Now, often we talk about highlights, but I have decided to change my slides and I'm going to call them lowlights because what has happened has just been truly catastrophic. Think about wild birds. More than 350 species have been impacted. That number is extremely out of date. We made that estimate about a year or over a year ago. And it's not just the number of species, it's also the scale. So here is an example. It is not an exception, it's just an example. But in the country of Peru, 40% of the Peruvian pelicans died in a matter of weeks. That's almost 1 in 2 individuals of a species disappearing from the landscape in just a few weeks. As I said before, it's in a huge diversity of mammals, mostly predatory and scavenging mammals, more than 50 species so far. And so the key outlier here is what's happening in South America, where really massive outbreaks are occurring in seals and sea lions. One location recorded 18,000 southern elephant seals dead, almost all of which were 1 to 2 week old. So that's an entire generation that has disappeared. Big impacts in poultry. Since the virus arrived in the US in early 2022, 100 million chickens have been culled. For comparison, Australia's biggest outbreak of avian influenza ever was the one that happened this year, 2024. And I think they culled about 1.5 million chickens. So that was a lot for us. It had a big impact, but that is a drop in the bucket compared to what other countries are facing. And of course, dairy cattle, over 200 farms, 14 states, having a really big impact on farmers, impacting cattle, and of course, human cases. So what you're looking at here is just to show you the diversity of human cases or the geographic distribution of those. So the dots in the back, those are the notifications I showed you before, but in this case, I just made them all the same color. The little light blue men, those are human cases due to this 2344B lineage. So low numbers, but pretty much everywhere where the virus is, we are seeing human cases. In Asia, you will see little humans of a diversity of colors. And that is to kind of highlight the fact that Asia contains more than one strain of H5N1. They're actually also struggling with 2321C, particularly in Cambodia, causing a number of human cases, as well as 2321A, which is found predominantly in places like India and Bangladesh. And more recently, they have reported reassortance between 2321C and 2344B in Southeast Asia. China also continues to have human cases with a related virus. This is subtype H5N6, but it is all part of the same H5 clade. So clearly what we've got here is a big One Health problem. So there's lots to say about what we are doing, but I'm just going to show you just 2 slides as a highlight, and I'm sure Guy will talk a little bit more about this. So about 2 years ago, we undertook quite a substantial risk assessment for Australia. There's a little link there, where we really thought about how this virus might arrive. And we identified a few key pathways. Due to time constraints, I'm just going to talk about this one. So of the pathways we identified, the most likely is with long-distance migratory birds. So what you're looking at here is a series of 3 maps. The one on the left, well, that's that notification data I've showed you a few times. The middle one there is the East Asian Australasian flyway, which is a wild bird flyway. And the dots there are birds that have been captured and flagged here in Australia, and the dots represent the places where those individuals have been seen. So birds flagged here in Victoria can be seen in Southeast Asia, Sea of Japan, and they're going all the way up to Siberia to breed. And once they finish breeding, they come back to Australia, stopping in many of the places. Now, if you take the map on the left and the middle map and you kind of squint a bit, you can see that many of those dots are overlapping, which tells you that the birds are stopping in places where HPAI is known to be on their way back to Australia. The other group of birds that we included as well are long-distance migratory seabirds. So birds like short-tailed shearwaters, here in Australia they're often referred to as mutton birds, are spending the non-breeding period in places like the Bering Sea and are coming back to Australia to breed. And millions of these individuals, both of shorebirds and seabirds, will arrive in Australia each spring. So right now is the key high-risk period for the introduction of avian influenza, because that is when these birds are returning from their migrations. Now, in response to this, for the last 3 years, my colleague Marcel Claassen and I have been running an enhanced surveillance program in the spring. Essentially, we have been going to as many places as we can to catch as many birds as we possibly can in that spring arrival window. So this is a map here to show you what we did last year. If you follow the little QR code, we've provided you with a summary of the results. But last year we went to catch shearwaters here in Victoria. We went all the way out to Broome to catch shorebirds and essentially working from October to December. And our plan for this year looks pretty similar, and we did start a few weeks ago, so we are in the middle of it. I'm going to leave it at that, but the key thing is that we definitely need your help. If you're out and about walking, bushwalking, and you see sick or dead birds, it is extremely important that you report these. No matter which state or territory you're in, you can use the Emergency Animal Disease Watch hotline. That number is 1-800-675-888. And the person on the other side of the line will tell you what to do, so please do follow those instructions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. That was excellent. Every time I hear you speak, I learn something more. And yes, no, that was super, especially the last slide on for participants to really know who to contact and to, you know, all of us to be part of the surveillance and to be working together. So thank you very much, and great timing too. I'd like to introduce our third speaker for the webinar, Dr Guy Weerasinghe. Guy is a public health veterinarian working with the Northern Australian Quarantine Strategy within DAF, the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. Within a multidisciplinary surveillance program focused on early detection of exotic pests and diseases across the vast northern coastline. The surveillance team program works in collaboration with a wide range of stakeholders, including Indigenous rangers. His role is primarily associated with policy, data management and leadership, though occasionally he is known to get out in the field and get his hands dirty. We're really looking and taking amazing photos. So we're really looking forward to seeing some of those photos and hearing more about the One Health work of the NARCS team in Northern Australia. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you, Andrea. Now, bear with me while I do my magic and hopefully this all works. I'm going to assume if no one calls out to me that this is coming to you loud and clear. I'm just this their Dunskies. Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I really appreciate, I guess, getting to come before you all and actually spruik about the work that my team has been leading. But I want to acknowledge that the work that I'm presenting here is but just a tiny sliver of work that complements the work that Michelle and Marcel are doing, as well as a lot of other players around Australia. And that is part of the larger cohort that we call the National Avian Influenza Wild Bird Surveillance Group. I call it NIWIB. I want everyone to start calling it NIWIB because it kind of annoys some people. So it's kind of a nice way to run with it. So the NIWIB crew is made up of researchers and institutions and state and territory jurisdictions. It's made up of, a few of us from the Commonwealth. And we grow the data there and we share it, we collaborate, we really become, dare I say, nerds of a feather who really get passionate about the subject of avian influenzas, and full credit to them for, I guess, making it an enjoyable process, even though, this is all doom and gloom about bird flu. It allows us to just identify who those technical experts are right at the drop of a hat. So let's jump into this. So a little bit about NARCS, or Northern Australian Quarantine Strategy. We are quite a mature program, been around for quite a while, and our primary focus is early detection of exotic pests and diseases and weeds that may enter into Northern Australia. And a lot of these pests and diseases may have significant impacts, like bird flu, onto our agricultural industries, as well as our social amenity and our environment. So it is quite One Healthy without, really putting it with that branding. We conduct a combination of active and general surveillance activities across the north, and I'm going to touch on a bunch of them. And I have to admit, we're really lucky to be one of the few Commonwealth-led programs that gets our hands dirty, literally, with the right PPE. And I have to fully acknowledge that through these journeys, we encounter amazing people and get onto the countries of many, many places and integrate with a lot of traditional owners. And I guess we get to learn from a lot of those traditional owners at the same time. So I really take my hat off to, I guess, the collaboration that we get with the space. Who's our team? So I've got my director is Darren. He's an ornithologist, ironically enough, by background. And then you've got our team. You can see we're a very small group of vets scattered across Northern Australia. And we all pretty much roll our sleeves up and get our hands dirty because that's what we need to do. Now, we have a number of surveillance activity types that we perform. And I guess the main thing I kind of want to stress with this is that Northern Australia is massive. It's huge, a coastline of 10,000 kilometers or more, as well as a wide variety of, different distributions of host animals that could catch these diseases. And so, as well as our near neighbors, Sub-I Island is only about 3 kilometers away from Papua New Guinea. So there's many different ways that a lot of these pathogens could enter. And so that's how I guess to sort of like not get too overwhelmed by it, we have a bit of a risk process to have risk-based surveillance activities in all these different zones that we call risk zones. And we do different activities like feral animal surveillance, domestic animal surveillance, environmental sampling, which is pretty much what I'm going to touch on, and a bunch of other activities. So I guess we are a small team, but I'd like to think we punch way above our weight. So I'm really proud of our team. So how do we look for them? Well, there's many different ways. Going to the public awareness space, we have this long-standing branding, which we get out there into the public. And when you you will, if ever you visit Northern Australia, you will encounter people who are wearing this hat. We have calendars that we get out to the Torres Strait, and sometimes they end up in the treaty villages in Papua New Guinea. So it's I guess a consistent brand that is a through line for us to then sell our messaging. For example, we have specific, disease-specific material to get content out there so that people can understand and appreciate what we're actually targeting. And it sort of works with that through line of the top watch biosecurity. We also do a lot of work with Indigenous rangers. And we work with Indigenous rangers because they are our eyes and ears on the frontier. We have collaborations with about 67 Indigenous range groups across Northern Australia. And it allows us to have an established intel source for if ever they see anything weird and wonderful, they would give us a call straight away. I kind of need to stress that because there is probably a very corporate want for people to pick up the phone and call an unknown government agency or an unknown person and report something. But we have found, and it's certainly a byproduct of our long-standing program, is that a lot of the benefit of what NARCS does is through relationship building. And we do that. I'd like to think we do that well. We try to really work hard at establishing relationships with our collaborators, including the Indigenous rangers. And that allows them to be more comfortable to pick up the phone and give us a phone call straight away. And then we can then enable the linkages with the relevant authorities. We have fee-for-service activities that we get the rangers to do. So that could include operational activities, such as running fuel out for our helicopter surveillance work, or it could be actual surveillance activities, which I'll touch on very soon. In terms of other things like development capability, we provide post-mortem training workshops. So we talk about PPE and we talk about how best to, cut up an animal. Like a lot of these guys are great at hunting and they're great at butchering. I'm not going to tell them how to suck eggs, but I do tell them what to look for when they are opening up these animals. And we try to be consistent with what we tell these rangers. We also have ranger forums that we fund and allow, the delivery of biosecurity information to these rangers. And we also do have some involvement in a Cert 4 for tropical biosecurity that rangers could enter into as well. Finally, in terms of collaborators, we also have private vets who we provide subsidies through this thing called NABSnet. So it's a collaboration with all the different northern jurisdictions. We all consolidate resources together, and then we provide it in a consistent manner. So that's another network of people we work with. So here's the disease that keeps me up at night. It used to be Japanese encephalitis virus, but kind of like, meeting your heroes, you finally do meet your hero. JE happened. We did a lot of work in that space. Switch gears now into something like AI. So I think through our work and collaboration with NIWIB, and in particular hearing and following reports from people like Michelle, we saw the writing on the wall. We saw that there was this growth in this and spread of this particular clade of H5N1. And so I just want to demonstrate that we upped our activity levels in response to that. And we did that as early as possible and identified that we needed to go more frequently to some places to actually look at the virus ecology, as well as visiting more places. So I guess that's just a quick snapshot of that. But then we also quickly recognized that we couldn't do it all ourselves. You guys have seen the size of my team. So we identified collaborators who we could work with to actually do more sampling for us in a safe manner. Now, one of the things that is how Michelle did touch on is that we've got a lot of surveillance work being done at the moment. We had a lot of focus on the waterfowl and the migratory shorebirds. Waterfowl are quite key to a lot of this discussion because they are great at catching the virus, but they're also really good at shedding the virus and moving it around within Australia. So a lot of our surveillance activities was actually highly focused on the waterfowl themselves, particularly ducks, sometimes magpie geese, but primarily ducks. And very recently, we've added a new element into our surveillance activities, which are the seabirds. And some people kind of get a bit lost in what's the difference between a shorebird versus a seabird. I'm just going to say that the shorebirds are the ones that you often see wandering up and down on the beaches, and they're sort of sticking their beaks trying to pick up little crustaceans, etc. While the seabirds are the ones that are often feasting on fish that they catch from the sea. I know that there's probably other greater distinctions, and I've probably got some ornithologists now lining me up to have big, long conversations about the differences, but that's sort of the rough way my brain sort of separates it out. And we sort of do our surveillance in those three different groups. So this is sort of a rough map that I whipped together of our surveillance activity. So I want you to all focus on those orange squares, rectangles. That's where our officers had been doing surveillance, and this is what we've been planning for 2024. So this is where we have been going out and doing surveillance over the last couple of years. Those stars truly represent the stars who we depend on quite strongly, are those Indigenous rangers. So these are the Indigenous rangers who have said, you know what, we'll help out and we'll do surveillance. So we've identified key areas we can get the rangers doing surveillance, and have trained them up on how to take samples and then how to distribute those samples in a safe manner where there's no risk of any sort of zoonotic transmission. Finally, as mentioned, the seabird element came to discussion, and we said, you know what, let's start exploring and deploying our surveillance in the external territories specifically. So the Indian Ocean territories, Ashmore Reef, Coral Sea, and we have got a team right now in Norfolk Island training up the Parks Australia DQ officers to help us do this sampling. And all of this sampling, it kind of goes complementary with what Michelle was demonstrating with her team's work. But what we're doing is regular sampling. So every month we take X number of samples, and it sort of helps us maintain, I'm going to hate myself for saying it, that canary in the coal mine kind of surveillance of looking of what's around. So we've got almost like an umbrella of surveillance going on around Australia as well as on the north coastline. And this is probably just an output of the surveillance work that we have done. So this is me collating all of our data and sort of putting it on a map for you guys to say, look, this is actually what's been happening. So all those dots just sort of represent the different kinds of surveillance activities being done by all of the different collaborators, including my team. You will see that we have been making detections of low-path avian influenzas. I guess that's our way of almost assessing and identifying whether we have been successful, is making those detections of endemic viruses. So it helps us make us feel at least comfortable that the system is working, that we are picking up stuff that is endemic, and then allows us to feel comfortable that, yeah, we are in the right place. And I guess those are some happy stats, as Andrea wanted me to throw in here, of some of the work that we do. In terms of species we're sampling, I think I have touched upon this, is that we do a lot of waterfowl sampling, and those are some of the species that we really opportunistically get the samples from. And we do also work in collaboration with other groups like the Australian Webiner sampling group. There's groups who do all the, those trapping of those migratory shorebirds, and they'll ban them and do all those other things. So we sort of join up with them and take samples at the same time. On top of that, we are doing those surveillance in the offshore areas, and that's where those seabirds come into it. We're also dabbling with the idea of to go, well, if we were to get this H5N1 and we do know it spills over into mammals, what are our systems or diagnostic systems going to look like, and how can we assure that our systems are ready? So because we do a lot of feral pig surveillance, we've been adding feral pigs into the mix with looking at what is that diagnostic pipeline going to look like, and identifying any gaps so that we can then be prepared during peacetime for that eventuality, if it is of interest. And certainly we are also exploring a molecular approach too. All that data gets dumped into that NIWIB, as I'm going to call it, just to be quick. So that's sort of just to give you a big bird's eye view of how we get that data and then wrangle it into where it needs to be. In terms of engagement, I'm running regular webinars for these for our Indigenous rangers. So every maybe 3 to 6 months, I run a webinar for them and say, look, here's the latest of what's happened, and also then update them with, I guess, any developments or improvements in the sampling techniques. And you can see down below, we also run some simulations of how to take samples carefully. You'll notice that they're not wearing PPE, but that was because that was a fake bird. But that also helps us maintain and continue relationships, which we think is really important. We also collaborate with a lot of northern stakeholders, including other Commonwealth agencies and states and territories. And as mentioned before, we have a lot of public awareness material, including those animations that we have funded, particularly for avian influenza. So that's sort of a bird's eye view of what we do, and just the amount of effort, blood, sweat, and not tears, but definitely sweat when doing this kind of work. I love my job, and I mean, I have to say that all that I'm doing is presenting some of the work that I have done, but primarily a lot of this is from the fantastic work my team does, as well as all those other stakeholders from Parks Australia to CSIRO to all of the Indigenous Ranger groups. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present, and I'll return you back to Andrea. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Guy. That's yeah, just fantastic, all the photos, and just want to reiterate that you have not detected in that surveillance any H5N1 2344B. So it's not in Australia, and
I would have grey hair.
Yeah, and that the NARC surveillance feeds into a broader surveillance system that Wildlife Health Australia is the collates and is the authority for the organisation for that surveillance. So please go onto Wildlife Health Australia's website if you want more information on the surveillance and that system. Thank you very much, Guy. I would like to now move to our final speaker, and you'll notice we've got a similar surname. I'd like to introduce Dr. Sarah Britton. She's an experienced executive leader with 30 years of One Health and biosecurity experience across government, private and not-for-profit sector. She's the director of the One Health unit within the interim Australian CDC, the principal consultant of One Health Biosecurity Solutions, and a non-executive director for Australian Eggs. She was the past New South Wales Chief Veterinary Officer, leading multiple emergency responses such as the Japanese encephalitis outbreak, and founded 3 startup business. She's very passionate about One Health and improving human, animal and ecosystems health. Over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. And I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be able to come and join this group today. And certainly the speakers before, I think, are just absolute legends in this field and their knowledge. So I feel very privileged to be able to come and join today. So I wanted to just touch upon, I've recently joined the interim CDC as the director of the One Health unit, and only been there 3 months at the moment. So probably in a similar theme as what Guy had been just mentioning, a very small team trying to embark on a very big journey. So I was just going to give a little bit of background about the interim CDC, the One Health unit, and then what's happening sort of from a national preparedness point of view from the One Health, and touch upon the Australian government HPAI task force and recent exercises, etc. So just a little bit about the interim CDC, and as some of you may be aware, it was established as a result of election commitment by the Australian government back in 2022. And really the purpose of this came out of COVID and ensuring that there's ongoing pandemic preparedness, an area to lead the federal response to future infectious diseases. And the focus of it really is about communicable and non-communicable diseases. So the interim CDC came into being earlier this year, was set up in January. And essentially what happened was the Chief Medical Officer's group as such was carved out of the Department of Health and then moved into the interim CDC. And then 2 new additional units were added over the course of time, and that was the One Health unit and the Health Security unit. So essentially the Health Security unit only just came into being in like a director in that in the last probably month or 6 weeks. And with the One Health unit, we just had a single person acting in that role sort of from February this year, and then I joined the team in July. So we have been, in that same vein, a very small team of 1 or 2 of us. And as of last week, we have now swelled to 5 temporary people at the moment. So we're feeling pretty flushed in comparison to where we were. So the point with the interim CDC is a couple of things. As I mentioned, it's trying to improve pandemic preparedness, preparing better for public health emergencies. It's wants to improve the national public health surveillance system. And if you go on the interim CDC website, there is a statement of intent with what was agreed between states and territories about what the interim CDC and the permanent CDC would hopefully have in place. So if you're interested in what that statement of intent is, just go to the interim CDC website. So the One Health unit. So through the process of establishing the interim CDC.
Sarah, could I just interrupt because you haven't shared your slides? Sorry, because we can't see your slides for some reason.
You can't see the slides?
No.
Ah, that is weird.
Do you want us to share them? Do you want us to pop it up?
Yeah, if that's okay, then I'm not quite. I'll just go back. Let me just try sharing them again.
Okay.
And just see. Is that coming up now?
Yes, that's work, but it's not in presentation mode. Sorry. Yep. All right. I should have stopped you earlier.
Okay. Does anyone want to see those slides?
Yeah. Do you want to just?
I'll just flick through it. Thanks for letting me know. And you can see them all okay now. Is that right?
Yes.
Great. Nothing different at my end, but good to know from your end. So yeah, that was the slide just talking about the establishment of the CDC. And I had briefly spoken about the key priorities of the CDC. So these are the couple of slides you missed. And now I was up to this slide. So essentially not too much information in those ones that you will have missed anything too much. So with the One Health unit, with the focus groups that were put in place, looking at how we developed the interim CDC, there was a really strong requirement and need that people wanted to see One Health was a underpinning principle of the interim CDC. So this is one of the key things that the One Health unit was established and to be able to brought in. And whilst I've got there, it's from a human health perspective. This is really from a One Health perspective. And certainly this was the wording that was used because it was coming out of the Department of Health, is, looking at what that focus would be. But I think as we are developing, that's definitely the understanding that this is a One Health approach, and it is for the health of humans, animals, and the ecosystems. And you need to have it all because the impact and consequences going very much around the circle. So the key sort of functions that we're looking at within the One Health unit is establishing those partnerships. And we heard Robyn talking about how important it was for communication, engagement, collaboration, understanding who the players are, what their roles are. And so that's a key focus of the area that we are looking at. And we've recently had joined the team someone that's their role is very much focused around engagement, social research, that aspect of it. The other part, which we haven't been able to develop yet, just due to resources, is about enhancing that horizon scanning. And this again, it's not all going to be delivered out of the One Health unit. This is about partnering with key organisations or other groups or people with expertise in being able to detect these items. So through the work that NARCS is doing and through Guy is doing, these are all data sources to be able to help us look at what we need to do and be able to probably improve that communication engagement going forward. And I think the key part in that is, many of the outbreaks that we've had, including the recent H7 and when we had Japanese encephalitis, if we looked back at all the information, that told us it was coming. And so part of that thing, we need to be better at the horizon scanning and being able to actually have that information before, rather than when we have the outbreak and look back and go, oh yeah, look, that was really evident that was coming. Part of our role, we embed the One Health lens across all the interim CDC and certainly then across, the Australian government and then going wider to our stakeholders, and a coordination role. So we're often the touch point in coming in from all the different sectors. And one of our other key roles, which I will touch upon, is the HPAI task force. So I'll just mention about that coming up. So just to give you a little idea now, I know there's a lot of acronyms on this slide, and it was partly because I couldn't fit all the full words in, but just to give you a bit of a concept about what we're moving across and sort of areas that we're working in. So we'll often be on some of the strategic meetings, and that is across the health sector, across the animal sector, and certainly across the environmental sector. So we will sit on the CDA, the Communicable Disease Network of Australia, and the Public Health Laboratory Network, and the National Arbovirus Monitoring Groups. And then we also sit on, as Guy said, NAWIB, the National Influenza Wild Bird Groups, the CCAD, which is the animal group that forms together in emergencies, and Animal Health Australia. So there's a whole range of different groups that we sit on strategically. And we have the One Health input into a variety of different areas, mainly at the moment focusing on the zoonotic and vector-borne diseases. So, for example, things from Japanese encephalitis and high PATHAI, obviously, and then input into like the poultry worker guidelines, the series of national guidelines for influenza, HPAI action plans, etc. So it's quite a variety of things that we're inputting in. I've given just a little bit of a summary of some of the things that are just happening on the health side, just to give you a bit of an idea that there has been a lot happening. While the focus for this disease has been very much about the wildlife and the animal impacts, there is still a very real issue for humans. And as Michelle mentioned, has been human infections overseas. And I think the big concern about this is it's an influenza virus. It has really well adapted into the wild birds, the mammals. This could change, and with enough animals that it's passaging through, there's real concerns about what's this going to be. Hopefully not the next pandemic, but there is a risk. So a couple of things that have happened on the health and the interim CD side is the National Incidence Centre was activated on the 20th of May. So that's really the coordinating agency, and most of you would probably be familiar with it playing a very major role during COVID. A lot of international monitoring and vigilance going on, international engagement directly back with the quadripartite groups. And then evaluating and ensuring the national medical stockpile is strategically placed to have the right vaccines and right number of vaccines for pandemic influenza and the antivirals if required. The Public Health Laboratory Network, it's been monitoring the situation and looking at how it can support and uplift any of the laboratory processes that are required. And ATAGI, so one of the groups focusing about the vaccines and immunisation, they've helped conducted scenario exercises to prepare for the development and guidance of advice, especially around vaccines. So also just under the normal process, just when we had the H7 outbreaks, we saw monitoring and surveillance of the humans. So whilst there was a lot talked about with the poultry and what was happening, each of the states and the jurisdictions were monitoring and doing surveillance of humans that were at risk, that had been in contact with those people. And the other key part is all the comms and engagement that needs to happen. And I think goes back to what Robyn said, is that's probably one of the key parts of it, and ensuring that we get proper advice and guidance out about what people at risk need, what vaccination advice would be, and national guidelines in place. And I've got up here, and it's touching a little bit more on what Guy has talked about. So there is a whole of Australian government preparedness process in place. And part of that is the establishment of the HPAI Preparedness Task Force, which was set up in July this year. And what that was looking at doing was trying to get in, well, a number of different things, but part of them was the number of preparedness exercises, which I'll touch on the next slide with Wille, and also to try to enhance the preparedness in a One Health approach. So what's happening with the HPAI task force is that the environmental, agriculture, and the human Australian government agencies are all working together. We've got staff embedded over at the Department of Ag, and likewise so has DQ, the environment agencies. And there is a number of different streams of work associated with that. I lead the One Health stream, and large part of that is looking at particular processes that are either gaps or are key areas that we need to be addressing, and I'll touch upon those in the next slide. The other key part's surveillance, which you're seeing what's happening through NARCs, but there's also surveillance happening just through, the human health mechanisms, and there's OFLU and all sorts of other areas that we are getting surveillance. The key part is about how we can actually bring some of that information together in a de-identified way that helps gives us better situational awareness. And I think that's, this is one of the challenges going forward, and we certainly saw this with Japanese encephalitis. The national coordination mechanism, and that was certainly one of the features of one of the exercises. Then there is a new crisis management released just recently from the national coordination mechanism, and that's looking about if we have something like HPAI, which is probably going to be multi-jurisdictional, this is going to be beyond just the mechanisms of each state, as we've often seen most of these responses. It's going to end up also involving a key action from the Commonwealth agencies through this national coordination mechanism. And as we've touched upon, the communications and engagement are an absolute key part of this and are a key focus of the HPAI task force. So the exercise Valari, that was a series of 3 national preparedness exercises, and they were held across August and September. And they were done in a pretty quick pace, and they initially involved the Commonwealth Government and then states and jurisdictions, and then went out to not-for-profits and key stakeholders. So there is a recording on the DAF website if anyone's interested in reviewing any of these webinars. But there was a number of different objectives. Really, the key one was to raise awareness and get action, and there's certainly been a lot happening in this space, but not necessarily always a great amount of information has actually filtered down to all the different areas. So with having all the exercises and also trying to put together the funding bids, the focus is really now on getting things done as a result of the findings from Exercise Valari, or also things done as a result of the funding announcements, which I will mention, and getting the things done that need to be done, because a lot of time has been taken up with actually, running the exercises and also, putting together funding opportunities. But this is really a One Health approach. This is like the key One Health people in my key collaborators across the Australian government. We're in contact all the time. We've got a WhatsApp group. We're chatting. We're doing this jointly. It's like we all work together. The key part now is the next stage is about how we involve the external stakeholders and how we involve states and territories much more efficiently. And that's a key focus for us. And certainly most of you may have heard this week about the Australian government funding, for 95 million or 100 million for HPAI preparedness. So a heap of work has gone in the last few months about trying to get this up. And it's really a huge win that we've been able to get this funding. And I think the key part now is about getting this well-resourced and actually getting outcomes from it in the next period of time, that we've got that funding available. So the key parts in the 37 million was enhancing national coordination of response arrangements and communications. So looking at some of those key issues we saw in Japanese encephalitis, where we've got well-established response mechanisms in the human health side and the animal health side. We need to boost what needs to happen on the wildlife side, but how do we actually all come together? And that was the issue that we had seen previously was, well, what do you do when it actually is affecting animals and it is affecting humans, and who takes the lead and all those sorts of things. So, having a national partnership agreements and having response programs that help guide those linkages is really, really important. There's 35.9 million across for boosting acceleration, preparedness and planning, especially in the wildlife sector and the target at-risk species. And there's 22.1 million to manufacture and store pandemic influenza vaccines. So this is on top of what had already been done in the national stockpile. So it's exciting. It brings its challenges and opportunities because it's highlighted how much interest, and we're in this little window of being able to prepare. And we are very keen to be able to use this to the best advantage to be able to be prepared and ready for when potentially H5N1 arrives on our shores, which the key part from a human health perspective is you know, supporting the environmental and agricultural components, as well as getting prepared ourselves, as everything we can do there is going to help minimize the, you know, the potential risk for human transmission. So with that, I will hand back to Andrea and across to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was excellent. And you know, the One Health unit and the Australian CDC getting, you know, established and being, you know, that Commonwealth is coordinating body for One Health. You know, it's going to be so very pivotal and important and really leading the way. And I think that's, you know, it's just great having you present on how that's already happening in a very short period of time. So congratulations to you and your team and all at the CDC. It's great to hear, and thank you very much. I'd like to move on now to the question and answer. Please be putting your questions in the Q&A box. Some have already been there. And I'd like our speakers, if you could pop up so that we can see you. And I have the privilege of asking the first question, and I'd like to ask this to Michelle, but the other speakers can also ask. I'm asking how an organisation like how the PHAA can assist better One Health integration of ecologists, virologists and lab scientists into collaborations for prevention, preparedness and response.
A great loaded question. I think that an organization like the PHAA should be working with various other organizations. I think in Sarah's talk, she did a really great job of sort of showing how many different branches from many different governments and states and jurisdictions are all coming together to think about this problem a little bit more holistically. And I think an organization like the PHAA can be integrated into the discussion as a key stakeholder organization. You know, public health comes a bit more from the human health side, and there will certainly be human health challenges everywhere where this virus has been. There have been human cases, and so the insights from an organization like the PHAA would be very useful here for us.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Michelle. Would anybody else in the group like to contribute to that insights for us? But that's okay if not, because we've got lots of questions.
I think also, just to my last point is, you know, members of the PHA are also people who like to go bushwalking. And so as an individual, you can, of course, all contribute to that passive surveillance by reporting any sick or dead birds.
Definitely. And I hope we all leave today knowing that our you know, individual role, let alone with our respective organizations.
I might throw in something else here, not only from the past, like to enhance our passive surveillance in terms of people going bushwalking or driving past poo ponds and looking for dead birds like I seem to do on my spare time. My kids hate me, but also thinking about building the trust with the general community. I think COVID really taught us that it's very easy for trust to be destabilized and other voices to be elevated as sources of information. And I think it's really important that PHAA and anyone who's in that space start actively being that voice of reason, being able to know where to steer people to. We all know that obviously there are individuals out there who don't respond to facts, and they often will respond to trust and relationships. So I think building relationships with different players out there is going to be really important, because the last thing you need is, well, what we saw a couple of years ago and just the chaos that caused when it came to dissemination of actual facts versus fiction.
Thanks, guys. Such yeah, very that trust, building that trust, and you know, and what Robyn was talking about with communication, risk communication, as Sarah was talking about risk communication and the work that's going in at the moment for you know, cross-sector communication plans. And yes, and I think Sarah wants to add maybe.
About communication?
Yes.
Yeah. Look, and I think maybe just evidence of just how seriously this has been taken. The communication people across all the Australian government agencies have been in like 2.5 days workshop in the last few days of trying to work out working out what is the best way to communicate. How do you actually get those One Health orientated messages? And I mean, this is a huge plus because they're really taking it seriously. And I think in the world of what Guy said, misinformation, and how do you actually get that information, and how do you deal with this without panicking the population? Because you talk about pandemics and you talk about vaccinations, and you know there's a lot of stuff that's come out of COVID, but being able to do that in an appropriate way that reflects across the whole spectrum, you know, appropriately, that it targets who you need. You need to really understand who you're targeting, and often the blanket messages aren't quite that.
Yes, and perhaps that's somewhere where PHAA needs to kind of network more in and be certain that we're communicating clearly and the right messages and in our advocacy and our policies. So yes, we'll certainly take that on board. I'd like to just ask the second question, and then I'll leave it over to my committee members. Ruth Zadok's asked, the current H5N1 epidemic is a wildlife pandemic as much as a livestock pandemic. Much as there is lots of room for improvement in commercial poultry production, and HPAI may and does emerge in intensive poultry systems, recent outbreaks in Australia being a case in point. To what extent is this pandemic attributable to intensive poultry production in your view? And I think that one's for Robyn.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Ruth, for an excellent question. Clearly, the spread of this current clade, wild birds, wild animals, wild mammals have been involved. However, it doesn't really let us humans off the hook, as we're not only talking about intensive poultry production. If we look at how this clade has spread within the US, what we know is that once it was emerged in dairy herds, it was spread to several states because of their production systems and having dairy cattle moving across states during their production cycle. And that was done and continued to be done even after the virus was discovered. If we're thinking about other influenzas, we also need to think about intensive pig production. So I think intensification of our food systems plays a crucial role. The other important thing is that if we think about our migratory species, human encroachment on their landscape, places where they would land and stop to rest, to feed during their journey, those places are being encroached upon by us. So in some cases, these migratory species able to spend time in a greatly reduced area of land or a greatly reduced part of the shoreline, and this will increase their density and increase contact between the day. I still think this is a human-induced problem. Over.
I would like to add to that, actually. So what we are dealing with now is this panzootic due to this 2344B lineage. But we really need to look at this holistically through time. So the ancestor of 2344B is called the Gusguandong lineage virus, and it jumped into poultry in 1996, and it was never, ever eradicated. So it had decades of spreading around poultry, particularly in Asia, opportunity to evolve. We started seeing the use of vaccines, vaccine-derived evolution in poultry. Then after spending all this time in poultry, it started jumping into birds, wild birds. 2005, we saw a jump, a lot of dead wild birds. 2014, we saw it jump into wild birds again, but it didn't stay in wild birds. 2016, it jumped into wild birds again. This one did a little bit better, this sort of new version. It stuck around in wild birds a little longer. 2020, it jumped again. And then it mixed again with poultry in Egypt, and it jumped back into Europe again. And so after all this evolution that's happened in poultry and all these jumps into wild birds sort of over and over and over, what you got was a virus that suddenly did really well in wild birds. And I would argue that's what sparked this panzootic, because it was wild birds that could spread at these massive distances. And we saw these big outbreaks in wildlife and jumping back into poultry then from wild birds. So historically, poultry were the key driver of this. You know, the problem we have today is arguably due to sort of not stamping this out from poultry decades ago. But if you think on the short term, it's very much being spread by wild birds. So it is quite a complex landscape.
Thanks, thanks, Michelle, and I'll just over to Simon for a question. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. There's a couple of different questions in the QA, but they really relate to coordination, communication. So the sort of foundational 3 C's of One Health. This is really a question directed at Sarah, given your experiences as a Chief Veterinary Officer and now embedded in the interim CDC. So how do we move, this is an emergency, well, it's seen as a growing emergency, and we're very good at working together in emergencies. What's being done or discussed to try and start embedding some of these cooperation approaches, or trying to integrate policy and practice so that we don't have to continue to redevelop our ways of working together across the different sectors? And particularly given what Michelle's just said about the longevity of influenza viruses. So this might be, I mean, mid-2000s was the first alarm. This is the second alarm, and I guess we might wait another 20 years for the third alarm.
Yeah, look, and I think an excellent question, because the beauty, I think, never let a good crisis go by. And, you know, I think the HPAI task force started up my first week when I came into the interim CDC. So part of that was like, how do we actually capitalise on this? Because this is the best One Health platform to be able to start growing those relationships. So I think one of the key things with something like the current preparedness is it's developing all those networks and relationships that need to be put in place. And whilst you need to then embed that with the systems that help in case obviously those people move around. But I think the part of this is that those key things are getting put in place, which are going to be used, and people know who to contact and are opening their eyes to the whole scope of people that are actually involved in these processes. And then looking at the work that's been done through the task force, it's actually addressing a lot of these issues that we had from Japanese encephalitis that, you know, currently we'd say, oh, we're not there yet. We're going to be faced with it. So there is a sense of urgency to be able to put in place those partnerships or the funding agreements and how you actually manage responses. You know, the revision of the crisis management framework for Commonwealth, I think there's a lot more maturity in that whole space about how to coordinate, and even coming out of COVID about what's that role and how to support the states and territories. So there's a lot happening, and there's a lot of passionate people. And I think in the whole space of One Health, biosecurity, that sort of area, it tends to be very passionate. So I think the key parts is that, as you say, the 4 C's of One Health, I think the key part's capability building as well. So through this process, we're doing that capacity building, the capability building, and setting up the systems to support all those relationships that are getting made.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. So just a quick look at Guy or Michelle, if you have any additional contributions, given you sort of sit in very different universes, but still key parts of this system.
I'm going to defer to Michelle. as one interplanetary occupier to another, I will let her have first dibs on this answer.
Oh, I'm going to admit a terrible thing. I was answering questions in the chat and I lost track of the question. So if you
Same
could please
here.
articulate it.
Okay, no, it was really a simple question. So Sarah was talking about the sort of institutional structures for how we move on from to crashing into these situations where we have to work together across sectors. So from your perspective, so NARCS I know works a lot with health departments and does, there's some outsourced health surveillance. But I guess from your own little universes, maybe just 2 or 3 words each on what you see as some of the keys to how you move forward so that people do this as part of their routine work rather than having to be reminded to work together.
Yeah, okay. Oh, you
Sorry,
go.
go.
And Michelle can go first. She got a nicer tree behind her.
Look, I sit in a university environment, and despite the fact that HPAI was a thing in 2005 and then no one cared about it for a long time and then it popped up again, I've been working on avian influenza for decades. And I think one of the benefits of universities is that we can keep working on these problems for a long time, even when they're not emergencies. Yeah, it's really hard for us to get funding in the interim, but we can think about these things in a long term where, from my perspective, and it may not be correct, but I find that often, public health agencies or animal health, they're there to respond to emergencies, they're there to respond to pressing things, and they don't have the longevity there. So critically, it's important for us to work together. It's important for agencies not to forget about university researchers who are experts. They're on the ground. They're thinking about this for years and years and years. And so that would be my advice from my corner of the world.
Thank you. Guy?
And from my corner of the sphere, I guess, yes, I think I really have to applaud things like NIWIB, and what Wildlife Health Australia has really fostered is just bringing, as I said before, those nerds of a feather together to actually cross-pollinate the ideas and actually go, oh, this is something I'm having trouble with, and oh, we can do this here. But in terms of getting further out, I think it is just, I think there's a real challenge that can be seen, and I certainly have seen it wearing the hat of, quote unquote public health vet, is that it's that challenge of trying to step into other lanes or into other silos and then trying to bring people across to that message. So when I go and talk to like human health professionals and I say, hey, let's talk about influenza, their headspace is purely focused on human influenza. So trying to then get that stretch to think outside of that is a bit tricky. And I think something like this kind of webinar is really good because it brings all the different players together and we can say, well, this is why this is important from the human health perspective. I think the other thing is really and certainly something that I get really fixated on is that the communication strategies need to be tailored. They cannot be one size fits all. And I think it's been really good to have this diverse set of opinions to work off to then find the right message that's going to win with the right people. Because I think we all know in the public health space that there's sign blindness to a lot of messaging. And so you always have to find what is going to get people's attention now that they've sort of gotten used to that usual message. Like how many people now walk straight past the wash your hands sign, as a result of that, even when that's plastered all over the toilets we go to. So I think it is important that that element be considered in any of the larger groups that are out there, is that you can't just go with a one size fits all message and then think that that's all that's going to work. You're going to have to update that messaging to try and catch people's eyes because we've got very fleeting attention spans. Thank you, social media.
I have one other thing based on what Guy was saying and also, how we can work together better. And arguably the reason the silos exist is because that is how everything is structured and that is how funding is structured. No one is going to work across silos unless there is some financial way for that to happen. And so, in the past, so I'm from the academic system. If I write humans in an ARC application, it'll be chucked in the bin. So I can't write a One Health application. And for the NHMRC, which is a medical board, well, you can't talk about animals because, so actually doing One Health work has been very difficult in the past because there's no real mechanism or incentive to do that. If you create a One Health CDC, that's awesome. You create One Health funding, well, suddenly there is sort of a mechanism and funding for us to work together, and we can actually devote our time and energy to do that. So money and sort of government structures that can cross that One Health space, I think are really important in getting us to work together. And as long as that can be maintained, we will probably continue to do that because there's a lot of will and desire to do One Health work. It's just proven to be very difficult because it's disincentivized through sort of the current structure.
Okay.
That's great. Thanks, Michelle and Guy and Sarah. No, that's great insights there and lessons for us to take on board. I think Hermina has a couple of questions, and we've got about four or 5 minutes left. So thanks,
Yeah.
Hermina.
Thank you. This one would be for Sarah. If you could comment on, has an environmental DNA water sampling protocol being created or implemented? I just think that in the context of what's happening in the US, wastewater surveillance has demonstrated its usefulness because there were several dairy farms that did not want to test cattle. So the only way to understand the situation was to actually rely on the wastewater surveillance results. Sarah, would you like to comment on this?
Sure, I can answer that one. Yeah, so as you pointed out, like over in the US, that wastewater surveillance is a sort of critical surveillance process, and it in that triangle of surveillance, it's the good broad way of being able to see if the virus is present. Of course, the downside to it is you can have multiple sources coming in there. So it depends if you're trying to work out if it's humans or birds or whichever it may be. So it really depends on the mechanism of how you're capturing it. The ability to be able to, certainly, as we saw through COVID, that wastewater surveillance was something that was implemented by states and territories, and to a degree that's petered out in some of the states and territories. There's not all of them doing it just due to a funding process, but there's definitely a drive to have a national strategy to wastewater so that it could be in place, because I think the value, if used appropriately for what the target is that you're trying to do the surveillance, there is use in being able to do that. And I think certainly Western Australia has, got a wastewater surveillance program in place for things like polio and other bits and pieces. The advantage Western Australia has is that their human population is fairly centralised into one area. So I think the answer is yes, and I think it's one of the things that there is value in, but how it's used, where it's used, and the interpretation of that information is very important.
Thank you, Sarah. Robyn, would you like to add anything to this question?
It's a great question, and I don't actually want to add to this one, but I do, if I can, just respond to one question that Tamara Riley has asked around engaging Indigenous health organisations and Indigenous communities. I think it's a really important question, and I think in Guy's work that probably is quite close. I'm not sure, and maybe it's my question to Sarah, is what Indigenous advisors are involved in the CDC. Over.
Yeah, thanks, Robyn. So, you may not be aware, the actual main body for Indigenous, it still sits with the main department. So it's not within there, but we actually interact very much so with the department. So it's not actually sitting there, like we'll have individuals, but we'll work across with them. And then as part of really the HPAI task force, and I think it's a really excellent question from Tamara, and we have had some discussions, is one of the key things that we want to be able to work with the First Nations people is about what is going to be the impacts of HPAI, H5N1 on those communities from a whole range of perspectives. But this actually is useful for all preparedness, that we consider this. So that work hasn't progressed or managed to get going forward yet, but it is absolutely seen as a priority that needs to be done. And we need people like Tamara to help us out.
Yes, definitely. Yes, and Tamara's a PHAA One Health SIG member, so please consider joining people, and it's great to have and Tamara back involved. Well, I think we've come to, unfortunately we could go on longer, but and the questions that haven't been answered, we will get those answered, and we will put them up on our Public Health Association Australia website under the One Health SIG area. So thank you everyone for all for your participation, for all the questions, and a big thank you to our speakers, to the One Health SIG committee members, and to PHAA support person Nora Salo. All of you, your time, your support, bringing this together in really a relatively very short period of time, and really, you know, a timely, very pertinent time. With the, you know, the funding that's come through this week, you know, $100 million, and just with where we're at, you know, in the spring, the high risk surveillance time at the moment. So thank you everybody for being involved. In the Q&A, there is a survey. It's very short, that will really help us. Just a few questions there. If you could take the time to do that, we'd be very, very grateful for that feedback. And thank you everybody. I think you know, it's been amazing. I've learnt a lot, and the diversity, and I really think, you know, we're really moving forward in One Health Systems approach, and having you all present and with better understanding, I think. Thank you very much, and I'm sure that the participants have a better understanding.